September 1944. The south of France. The Third Reich was bleeding to death. In the north, the Allies had broken out of Normandy. In the east, the Soviet steamroller was crushing the Wehrmacht. And here, in the sun-scorched landscapes south of the Loire River, an entire German army group had become a wandering ghost. This was the strange, desperate reality of Major General Botto Henning Elster. He commanded 20,000 men. A sprawling, chaotic column of infantry, naval personnel, Luftwaffe ground crews, and panicked administrative staff. They were heavily armed, but they were effectively already dead. They were cut off. To their north lay the unstoppable armored spearheads of General George S. Patton's Third Army, racing across France with a speed that defied military logic. Patton wasn't just taking territory. He was erasing the map. His tanks were bypassing German strongholds, severing supply lines, and leaving enemy units to rot on the vine. But for General Elster and his 20,000 men, the Americans were not the immediate nightmare. The true nightmare was the woods, the hedgerows, the abandoned farmhouses. The French resistance, the FFI, had risen. For 4 years, these people had lived under the boot of Nazi occupation. They had seen their friends executed, their food stolen, their cities bombed. Now, with the Germans on the run, the time for patience was over. The time for vengeance had arrived. Elster's column was being bled white, mile by bloody mile. Sniper fire from the tree lines took out officers. Bridges were blown up moments before the trucks arrived. Stragglers who fell behind the main column were found the next morning with their throats cut. The FFI did not take prisoners. They operated on a brutal arithmetic of retribution. Elster knew the military situation was hopeless. His orders from Berlin were clear. Fight to the last man. Turn every village into a fortress. Die for the Führer. But Elster was not a fanatic SS commander blinded by ideology. He was a Prussian aristocrat, a career soldier who understood the difference between bravery and suicide. He looked at his men, ragged, hungry, terrified, marching in boots that were falling apart, and he realized that fighting the Americans would be a massacre. But surrendering to the French resistance would be an execution. He was trapped between the hammer of Patton and the anvil of the French partisans. In the command tent, surrounded by anxious staff officers, Elster made a decision that would have been considered treason in Berlin. He would not fight. He would not die for a lost cause. He would try to negotiate. But he wouldn't negotiate with the French. He needed a professional soldier. He needed someone who followed the Geneva Convention. He needed to reach George Patton. The irony was thick. Elster was seeking protection from the most aggressive, violent, and ruthless general in the American army. He was betting the lives of 20,000 men on the hope that old blood and guts respected the code of chivalry more than the lust for blood. Making the decision to surrender was dangerous. Executing it was nearly impossible. How do you tell an enemy army that is trying to kill you that you want to talk? In 1944, there were no direct lines. Every radio frequency was monitored. And inside Elster's own ranks, there were die-hard Nazis who would put a bullet in his head if they smelled betrayal. The breakthrough came in the form of a young American lieutenant named Samuel McGill. McGill was operating deep behind enemy lines, working with the French resistance. He was a cowboy diplomat, a man who understood that the chaotic battlefield of 1944 required unconventional solutions. Elster managed to establish contact with McGill. The message was simple but staggering. I have 20,000 men. I have artillery. I have trucks. And I am willing to hand them all over to you, but I have conditions. It was an audacious move. A defeated general dictating terms? But Elster was firm. He demanded a surrender with honor. He demanded that his men be allowed to keep their personal weapons until the final ceremony. He demanded that the Americans, not the French, take custody of his troops. And most importantly, He demanded protection. When this proposal reached General Patton's headquarters, the staff officers were stunned. The standard operating procedure was unconditional surrender. You don't negotiate with Nazis, you crush them. But Patton, the man who famously slapped a soldier for shell shock, the man who preached violence and aggression, saw something else. He looked at the map. He looked at his supply lines. Patton's tanks were thirsty. They were consuming hundreds of thousands of gallons of gasoline a day. His army was stretched thin, racing toward the German border. If Elster decided to fight, he could tie down an entire American division for weeks. He could force Patton to stop, turn around, and spend precious fuel and ammunition digging 20,000 Germans out of the French countryside. Patton realized that Elster wasn't offering a surrender. He was offering a gift. He was offering time. "Let them keep their guns," Patton reportedly said. It was a shocking order. Allow 20,000 enemy soldiers to march armed through Allied territory? It sounded like madness. But Patton understood the psychology of the soldier better than anyone. He knew that by allowing Elster to keep his pistol, by allowing the troops to carry their rifles, he was preserving their dignity. And a man who retains his dignity is less likely to fight to the death than a man who is humiliated. The deal was struck, but the hard part was just beginning. Elster had to march his sprawling column of exhausted men over 100 kilometers through the heart of hostile French territory to the rendezvous point at the Loire River. The march that followed is one of the most surreal episodes of World War II. Imagine the scene. A column of German soldiers, miles long, moving through the French countryside. But they weren't alone. Flanking them were American jeeps and armored cars. Not attacking them, but escorting them. Above them, American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers roared through the sky. These planes, which usually rained death upon German columns, were now flying top cover, dipping their wings to signal the route. They were acting as sheepdogs, herding a massive flock of gray-clad wolves. The danger was real. The French resistance was furious. They watched from the hills, rifles in hand, itching to descend upon the Germans and extract their pound of flesh. They saw the Americans protecting the very men who had occupied their country, burned their villages, and deported their neighbors. Lieutenant McGill and his small team of Americans had to play a high-stakes game of diplomacy at every crossroads. They had to convince angry French partisan leaders to stand down. "These are our prisoners," they would argue. "Let them pass." Inside the German column, the tension was suffocating. The soldiers walked with their fingers on the triggers of their Mauser rifles. They weren't looking at the Americans. They were watching the tree lines, the windows of the farmhouses, the ditches. They knew that if the American protection failed, even for a moment, the march would turn into a slaughter. General Elster rode near the front, maintaining a stoic Prussian facade. But inside, he must have been terrified. One trigger-happy private, one mortar shell from a hidden French squad, and the ceasefire would shatter. His 20,000 men would panic, the Americans would return fire, and the countryside would become a bloodbath. It was a slow, agonizing parade of defeat. But mile by mile, the column held together. The discipline of the Wehrmacht, even in its dying days, was formidable. The men marched in step. They kept their uniforms buttoned. They were defeated, yes, but they were determined to finish this last mission. The mission to survive. Finally, the Beaugency Bridge came into view. The bridge spanned the Loire River, a massive stone structure that would serve as the stage for the final act of this drama. On the other side waited Major General Robert Macon of the U.S. 83rd Infantry Division. He stood there not as a conqueror, but as a professional receiving a professional. September 16, 1944, the day of the surrender. The sky was overcast, casting a gray, somber light over the river. The atmosphere was quiet. There was no cheering, no gunfire, just the sound of thousands of boots striking the pavement and the rumble of truck engines. General Elster stepped out of his car. He was immaculate. Despite weeks of retreat and fear, his uniform was pressed, his boots polished, his iron cross hanging squarely at his throat. He walked to the center of the bridge where General Macon waited. The cameras of the U.S. Signal Corps were rolling. This was a propaganda victory of immense proportions, and the Allies wanted the world to see it. But for the men on the bridge, it was a personal moment. Elster halted. He saluted. Macon returned the salute. Then came the moment that would define the event. Elster reached to his holster and unclipped the leather flap. He pulled out his Luger P-08 pistol, the symbol of his authority. He held it out, handle first, to the American general. "I surrender my troops and my equipment to you," Elster said. General Macon took the pistol. He looked at it for a moment. He felt the weight of it. In a standard surrender, this gun would end up as a souvenir on a mantelpiece in Ohio or Texas. But Macon handed it back. "Keep it, General," Macon said. "You have surrendered with honor." This gesture sent a shockwave through the ranks. The German officers watching gasped. The American MPs stood stoically, but even they understood the significance. By returning the sword, or in this case the pistol, the victor was acknowledging the humanity of the vanquished. Following this, the disarmament began, and it was staggering. For hours, the German soldiers marched past designated piles. A mountain of Mauser rifles grew higher and higher. Piles of steel helmets, pyramids of grenades. The Americans collected over 20,000 small arms, hundreds of machine guns, and dozens of artillery pieces. But the mood was not one of humiliation. It was one of relief. You could see it in the faces of the German soldiers captured in the newsreels. They were lighting cigarettes. They were smiling. They were talking to the American GIs. For them, the war was over. They wouldn't die in a frozen ditch in the Battle of the Bulge 3 months later. They wouldn't be crushed by Russian tanks in Berlin. They were going to America. They were going to survive. Patton didn't attend the ceremony personally. He was too busy planning his next attack. But his spirit was all over it. He had orchestrated a masterclass in psychological warfare. He had proven that sometimes the most effective way to destroy an enemy army is not to blow it up, but to give it a way out. However, every story has a cost. For General Elster, the war ended at the bridge, but his battle was far from over. When news of the surrender reached Berlin, Adolf Hitler was apoplectic. The Third Reich was crumbling, and the Führer demanded fanaticism. The idea that a German general would surrender 20,000 men without firing a shot, and worse, surrender them with honor, was an abomination to Nazi ideology. A military tribunal was convened in Germany. In absentia, Botho Henning Elster was charged with cowardice and treason. He was sentenced to death. The Nazis arrested his 62-year-old wife and threw her into prison, holding her hostage for the crimes of her husband. His name was disgraced, erased from the rolls of honor. Elster spent the rest of the war in a POW camp in Clinton, Mississippi. It was a far cry from the Eastern Front. He lived in comfort, ate well, and studied history. But the shadow of the death sentence hung over him. He didn't know if his wife was alive. He didn't know if he would be executed if he ever returned to Germany. It wasn't until the war ended in 1945 that Elster was cleared. A post-war German court reviewed his case. They looked at the maps. They looked at the disposition of his forces. They looked at the inevitable slaughter that would have occurred. The court exonerated him. They declared that Elster had acted not out of cowardice, but out of a high sense of responsibility. He had chosen the lives of his men over the pride of a dictator. He had chosen reality over ideology. General Elster died in 1952, a free man. But his legacy lives on in the 20,000 families who welcomed their fathers and sons home after the war. And what of George Patton? The surrender at Beaugency Bridge remains a fascinating footnote in the legend of Old Blood and Guts. We remember Patton for his ivory-handled revolvers, his speeches about greasing the treads of tanks with enemy guts, and his relentless drive. We think of him as a blunt instrument of war. But the Ulster incident reveals a different Patton. It reveals a sophisticated strategist who understood the ancient laws of war. Patton knew that brutality has a diminishing return. If you butcher everyone who tries to surrender, the enemy will never surrender. They will fight like rats in a corner, biting and scratching until the end, costing you time and blood. By allowing Ulster his dignity, Patton weaponized honor. He sent a message to every other German commander in France. The Americans are warriors, not butchers. If you fight, we will destroy you. If you quit, we will treat you like men. It is a lesson that echoes down through military history. In the heat of battle, amidst the smoke and the hate, it is easy to pull the trigger. It is easy to crush the enemy under your boot. It takes a different kind of courage, a moral courage, to shake his hand. That day in September 1944, on a gray bridge over the Loire, two enemies proved that even in a world gone mad, civilization had not completely vanished. They proved that while soldiers fight wars, it is men who must end them.